Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we aren't just wading in, we are going straight to the bottom of the ocean.
We are.
We're continuing our journey through the AI Futures series, and frankly, the source material we have today it's heavy.
It is good to be back. And you're right, it's heavy. Not difficult to read, but the implications are just massive.
Exactly. It's structural, it changes how you look at the internet, your business, and maybe, I don't know, maybe even your own thoughts.
Yeah, this isn't about the wow factor of a new chat bot or some cool image generator. If you missed the previous discussions, we are deep into a serialized analysis of what the world actually looks like under maximum AI adoption.
Right.
We're moving past the hype cycle, the look what it can do phase, and into the infrastructure cycle, the who owns the pipes phase.
And before we get into the meat of today's topic, which is titled AI Decentralization, I want to recenter us on the mission statement for this whole series. It is so vital we remember the lens we are using, because without it, this can all sound a bit abstract. As the author of this framework, Jafar Humayun, puts it, AI Futures is not a forecast, it's a framework. This series explores how AI may unravel the systems we take for granted, not to alarm, but to challenge assumptions and spark deeper thinking about what comes next under maximum AI adoption.
And that distinction, framework versus forecast, that is the anchor for everything we're about to discuss.
It really is.
We aren't predicting stock prices for NVIDIA or Microsoft. We aren't telling you, which gadget to buy next week. We are looking at the tectonic plates moving underneath the economy and society.
The physics of information, as you said.
Exactly. The physics of it all.
So episode 28, AI Decentralization. I have to be honest, when I first hear decentralization, my brain immediately goes to, crypto bros, blockchain, libertarian manifestos.
Seasteading, right?
Yeah, exactly. Are we talking about that? Are we putting AI on the blockchain?
Thankfully, no. We are not talking about finance, and we're definitely not talking about tokenomics in that sense. We're talking about the structural tension between a global, centralized AI infrastructure.
Which is the path we're on right now.
The default path we are currently sprinting down, yes.
Yeah.
And the concept of local digital sovereignty.
Okay, so let's clear the air immediately. The source material is very, very specific about this. This isn't an anti-corporate rant.
Not at all.
We aren't here to grab pitchforks and call for the breaking up of big tech just because they're big.
No, that would be completely reductive. This isn't about morality, it's about mechanics. It's about what the framework calls operational agency.
Okay.
And it frames the central question of this episode, which is, when AI becomes the default operating layer of an entire economy, when it runs the banks, the schools, the hospitals, the traffic lights, what happens to a society's self-determination if that operating layer is managed entirely by someone else, somewhere else?
So it's the difference between renting intelligence versus owning the infrastructure of thought.
That is the hook. That's the whole thing right there.
Yeah.
We need to understand if we're moving toward a world where we all just rent our capacity to think, or if there is actually a path to owning it. Because right now, the rent is due.
And the landlord has a lot of leverage.
A whole lot of leverage.
So let's map out the current landscape, because I think people have a misconception about where AI actually lives. We experience it as ubiquitous. It's on my phone, it's in my browser, it's rewriting my emails. It feels like air.
It feels like it's everywhere and nowhere.
Exactly. But physically, that is not the case at all.
Not even close.
Yeah.
That is what the source material calls the gated cognitive commons.
Gated cognitive commons. Okay.
Yeah. If you look at the physical map of cognitive infrastructure, and by that I mean the massive data centers, the H100 GPU clusters, the training runs that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, it is incredibly concentrated.
So we're talking about a geographical concentration, not just corporate.
Both. Yeah. Geographic and corporate. You have a handful of hyperscalers, mostly in the United States, specifically in places like Northern Virginia or Oregon, with a completely separate parallel ecosystem in China.
Right.
This isn't the distributed network of the early internet where anyone could, host a website from a server in their basement.
That's long gone.
This is a heavy industry. This is much closer to building a nuclear power plant than it is to coding a website.
So why is it so concentrated? Why can't I just build a frontier model in my garage? I mean, innovation usually comes from the garage, right? That's the story we tell ourselves.
That era might be, it might be taking a pause. The barriers to entry here are basically physics and capital.
Okay.
To train a model like GPT-4 or the upcoming frontier models, you need tens of thousands of specialized GPUs running in parallel for months on end. You need energy contracts that literally rival the consumption of small cities.
Wow.
You need cooling systems that require massive water rights. And then you need the human stack, the PhDs, who actually know how to tune the weights on these things.
And that talent pool is small.
Tiny, maybe a few thousand people globally, and
Exactly.
they're all hired by like 3 or 4 companies.
So the disruption this technology causes, it isn't linear. It's not like a new textile mill in the 1800s where you could just buy a loom and compete.
No, it is highly, highly nonlinear. A single frontier model can outperform thousands of humans across a huge variety of cognitive domains. So if you own that model, you possess a massive asymmetry and capability compared to everyone else.
It's a huge gap.
The gap between having the model and not having the model is probably the widest capacity gap we've seen since, I don't know, the invention of the steam engine.
And this leads us to the concept you mentioned, the illusion of access. As a user, I feel powerful. I can ask the AI to write a sonnet or code a Python script, but you're saying that feeling of power it's deceptive?
It's the difference between owning the water plant and buying a bottle of water.
Ah.
You have access to the output, not the engine. The business model is intelligence as a service. You're a consumer of thought, not a producer of the means of thought.
Which brings us to the economics of it all. If I'm a business or a government and I'm using these tools, what am I actually paying for?
You are renting cognition by the token. Every single time you ask a question, every time you generate an image, you are paying a microtransaction.
And if AI becomes the operating layer of my business,
Then thinking itself becomes a recurring operational expense.
that's just a wild concept. Thinking as OpEx. Operational expenditure. Usually, we think of software as something we buy or license, and then it's ours. We run it.
It completely changes the balance sheet of innovation. Currently, if you solve a problem, that solution is yours. You own it. In this new model, to solve the same problem again tomorrow, you have to pay again.
And crucially,
And crucially, that process is subject to external pricing, external availability, and external terms of service. Imagine if your ability to draft a contract or analyze a spreadsheet depended on the fluctuating spot price of a GPU cycle in a data center 3,000 miles away.
you're completely at their mercy. The source material uses a structural analogy here. It compares the current model to a system where the infrastructure owners hold all the land and everyone else just pays to till it.
And we want to be careful here. It is really easy to slip into loaded terms like feudalism because that implies a social hierarchy that doesn't quite fit.
Right. This is economic, not social.
This is purely economic. It is a concentration of compute and capital. If you don't own the compute, you are, for all intents and purposes, a tenant in the cognitive landscape.
And tenants are vulnerable. If the landlord decides to renovate or sell the building or just double the rent.
The tenant has very, very few options.
Which brings us to the mechanics of that dependency. We need to dissect what these giants actually control. It isn't just the chatbot, is it?
No, it's the whole stack. We
Mhm.
call this the intelligence stack. And it's vital to understand the layers because that is where the control points are hiding.
Okay, walk us through the stack. Where are the choke points?
It starts at the very bottom with the data pipelines. Who has the pipe to suck up the world's information? Then, the training infrastructure, the silicon and the steel we just talked about.
The expensive stuff.
The really expensive stuff. But then it gets more subtle. You have the update cycles.
Update cycles. What do you mean?
Who decides when the model gets smarter? Who decides when it learns new information?
That seems incredibly critical. If the world changes, say, a new law is passed or a conflict breaks out, and the model isn't updated, the model is effectively lying by omission.
Precisely. If you are a law firm relying on a model for legal advice, and it hasn't been updated with this year's Supreme Court rulings, you are operating on an obsolete reality.
And you, the user, you can't force an update.
You can't. You have to wait for the provider to push it.
Okay, what's the next layer up in the stack?
The alignment layers. This is a big one. Who decides what is safe or appropriate or biased for the model to say? And finally, you have the interface rules. These are what the source calls the control points. They aren't just technical specs, they are gateways to agency.
I want to drill down on alignment as a control point, because usually we hear about alignment in the context of safety stopping the AI from building a bomb or generating hate speech. That sounds good. Who would argue with that?
And it is good. But safety is the Trojan horse for culture. Yes, we all agree on preventing bomb making, of course. But what about political nuance?
Or historical interpretation.
Exactly. Or definitions of gender or marriage or justice. Alignment is not just about safety, it is about normalization. It sets the boundaries of acceptable thought within the system.
So if you control the alignment layer, you control the window of discourse for every single person using that model.
You define the Overton window for the users.
Yeah.
If a model is aligned to be polite by, say, Californian standards, it might be perceived as passive-aggressive in New York or obsequious in Tokyo. But more importantly, if it is aligned to avoid controversial topics, who defines controversy?
The company that owns the stack.
Exactly.
Right.
And that definition is usually whatever maximizes our commercial viability and minimizes our regulatory risk. That is not necessarily the same thing as truth or the same thing as what a local culture values.
Let's talk about the specific risks here, because structural risk can sound a bit abstract. What does this look like in practice for a business or a government that relies on these rented models?
Well, the most obvious one is deplatforming. We've seen this happen in social media, but imagine it for your cognitive infrastructure.
Your whole company's brain.
Right. If your entire business logic relies on an API call to a central lab and they decide your use case violates a new arbitrary policy,
You're done. Lights out.
instantly, there's no appeal process. You are just a line of code that got commented out.
Okay. What else?
Then there is API throttling. Maybe they don't ban you, but they just slow you down. Or price hikes. This is a huge one. Once you have built your entire workflow around a specific model, say GPT-4, you are price inelastic.
You're locked in.
Totally locked in. You've integrated it into all your software. If they double the cost per token, what are you going to do? You pay it or you go out of business.
And geo-restrictions. We often assume the internet is global, but AI is increasingly being nationalized.
This is a huge issue. A lab in California might decide or be told by the U.S. Department of Commerce not to serve IP addresses in certain countries. If you're a startup in a sanctioned region, or even just a region that is commercially uninteresting, you might find yourself geo-fenced out of the entire intelligence layer.
So the consequence here is that what starts as innovation, look at this amazing tool I can use, eventually just turns into dependency.
Exactly.
And digital sovereignty can dissolve not through a conflict or a treaty, but just through a software update.
If the API changes or the terms change, your ability to operate changes. You are not in control of your own capacity to function. You have agency, but only as long as the terms of service allow it.
This segues perfectly into the next major theme of this deep dive, the extraction of logic, or what the source calls cognitive misalignment.
Yeah, this is a subtle, but I think a really profound point. We tend to think of software as neutral. Math is math, right? A neural network is just matrix multiplication. It shouldn't have an opinion.
But you're saying the AI stack is not neutral.
The stack is deeply geopolitical and culturally specific. It is trained on data from specific places created by people with specific worldviews.
So you have this imported logic problem.
Exactly. Imagine a nation relying on a foreign model to interpret its own local data, or an education system importing logic patterns that don't align with local cultural values.
Can you give me a concrete example? I want to visualize this misalignment.
Sure. Take the legal system. Law is not universal. It is intensely local. It relies on precedent, culture, and specific jurisdictional definitions. So if a court in, say, Indonesia uses a generic U.S.-trained model to summarize legal precedents or draft arguments, that AI is statistically likely to hallucinate U.S. legal concepts.
It starts quoting the First Amendment or something.
It might reference Miranda rights or specific tort laws that simply do not exist in Indonesian code. It imposes a foreign legal framework simply because that framework was more prevalent in its training data.
So it overrates local nuance with a global and, let's be honest, usually Western generalization.
That's it. And it happens in medicine, too. Medical protocols vary by region based on available drugs, genetic prevalence of diseases, and local ethics. A model trained on Boston hospital data might give advice that is dangerous or just completely irrelevant in Nairobi.
So you are embedding tools you do not own and, more dangerously, tools you do not fully understand the bias of.
And we have to be really careful with our language here. The instruction is to avoid the term colonialism. It's too charged and historically specific.
Huh.
But the dynamic is one of cognitive misalignment. It's a scenario where a local system is forced to operate inside someone else's logic. You are fitting your square peg into their round hole because that's the only hole available.
And there is this concept in the source of the silent shutdown.
That is the ultimate risk of dependency. In the past, if a country wanted to disrupt another, they might blockade a port. It's visible, it's loud, it's an act of war. CNN would be there.
Right. It's an event. You see it happening.
In the cognitive age, the silent shutdown is when the cloud simply cuts access. There's no explosion, no blockade, just the screen goes blank. The API returns an error 404,
It's a silent loss of capacity.
but completely silent loss of national capacity. And there is often no recourse. You
Yeah.
can't bomb a data center halfway across the world because your login stopped working.
That is a chilling thought, just disconnected from intelligence.
Well,
So naturally, the conversation has to turn to the alternative. If reliance is so dangerous, what is the case for local infrastructure?
this is the core of the argument for decentralization. And again, we need to be really clear about what we mean by that.
It's not about everyone running their own server in their basement and chaos reigning supreme.
No, it is about self-determination.
Hmm.
It is about having a choice. It's about things like data residency and operational sovereignty.
Let's break those down. Data residency. That sounds like compliance paperwork. Why does it matter to the average person or a business owner?
It sounds dry, I know, but it's actually about national security and privacy. Imagine you are a healthcare provider. You have patient data, diagnoses, genetic info, mental health records. If that data has to be sent to a server in another country to be processed by the AI, it is crossing a legal border.
And once it crosses the border, whose laws apply?
The laws of the country where the server sits. So if the U.S. government issues a subpoena to a U.S. cloud provider, they can access data sitting on their servers, even if that data belongs to French or Brazilian citizens.
So data residency, keeping the data processing inside your own borders, is a shield.
It's a legal and a technical shield. It ensures that your citizens' data is subject only to your laws. But you can't have data residency if you are using a closed API from a foreign provider. You have to be able to host the model yourself.
And what about the cultural aspect? We talked about imported logic. How does local infrastructure fix that?
It allows you to train models on native languages to preserve cultural nuance. Large models are great at English. They're okay at major languages like Spanish or French. They're often terrible at dialects, smaller languages, or high-context cultural references.
If you lose the language, you lose the culture. It's that simple.
Language encodes culture. It's the DNA of culture. If your entire education system uses a model that only speaks corporate English, you are slowly, silently eroding the local dialect. Local infrastructure lets you build or fine-tune models that actually speak the way your people speak, using the idioms and metaphors that make sense to them.
And the third point you mentioned was about law.
Yeah, embedding national law directly into the system's behavior. So instead of relying on a generic safety filter that was designed in a U.S. company, you can encode your own regulatory framework into how the model operates. You align the model to your constitution, not their terms of service.
So it's not just about preference. The source material calls this a survival mechanic.
Yes,
That's
absolutely. Because it is a defense against becoming what it calls foreign policy collateral.
collateral.
Yeah. If two superpowers get into a trade war and you are relying on one of them for your cognitive infrastructure, you might get cut off simply because you were caught in the crossfire. You aren't the target, but you lose your capacity anyway.
The stakes are incredibly high then. If AI is the backbone of law, education, and healthcare, not owning it means you're living inside an external logic framework. You are essentially a guest in your own house.
That is a really powerful way to put it.
But, and there is always a but, we have to be realistic. This is the speculative realism section of our deep dive. Can we actually beat the giant labs? Can a smaller country or a company really compete with the trillions of dollars being poured into the frontier?
If by compete you mean build a better model than GPT-6 from scratch, the answer right now is almost certainly no.
So total independence from the frontier, that's unrealistic. We can't all build our own Google.
Right. The capital expenditure is too high. The energy requirements are too high. So we have to look for what the framework calls exits from total dependence.
Not replacements, but exits.
Exactly. Strategies that give you leverage. They give you options.
Okay, so what are those exits?
Well, the first and probably most important one is fine-tuning OpenStacks. We've seen a rise in really high-quality open-source models. Llama from Meta, Mistral from France, Falcon from the UAE.
Explain the difference between building a model and fine-tuning it for the listeners.
Think of the base model like Launi as a university graduate. It knows a lot about the world. It can read and write. It understands logic. That university education cost maybe $100 million to produce. You get that for free or very efficiently.
Okay.
Fine-tuning is like sending that graduate to a specific job training program. You teach it your local laws, your internal company documents, your specific language.
And that does not cost $100 million.
Not even close. It might
Yeah.
cost $10,000
Oh, yeah.
or $100,000. It is orders and orders of magnitude cheaper. You aren't building the engine from scratch. You are just tuning it to drive on your roads.
That seems like a much more achievable goal for a smaller nation or a company.
It is the primary bridge to sovereignty right now. You leverage the global R&D, but you customize the last mile to fit your context.
Okay, so what is the second exit?
Edge inference. This is crucial for resilience.
So that's running models locally on a device, on your phone or computer.
Yes, on the device or on a local server rack. For critical high-security sectors like hospitals, energy grids, and defense systems, you simply cannot rely on the cloud. You just can't. You need the model to run here, right now, regardless of your internet connection or what's happening in foreign policy.
It's faster, safer, and private. But isn't it dumber? I mean, a phone can't run a model as big as a data center can.
That is the trade-off. You are trading maximum intelligence for maximum reliability and privacy. But for many, many tasks, you don't need a genius. To route traffic or summarize a medical chart, a smaller local model is perfectly adequate. And it works when the internet is down.
Which is a huge deal. Okay, and the third exit is open governance.
This is about creating stacks where the laws shape alignment rather than corporate values. It's about building a governance layer that sits on top of the model and ensures it behaves according to local rules. It turns safety from a corporate black box into a transparent civic standard that people can actually debate and shape.
And finally, decentralized marketplaces.
Right, so instead of going to one giant store for all your AI needs, you have a marketplace of different models. You can benchmark them, you can swap them out. If one provider raises prices, you switch to another.
It introduces competition and resilience.
It prevents vendor lock-in, which is the end goal of any big platform.
So the goal isn't to replicate the frontier labs, it's to avoid absolute reliance on them.
Precisely. You want leverage, you want options, you want to be able to say no to the landlord.
But there is a catch. There's always a catch. The source material talks about the intelligence capacity gap.
This is the friction point that everyone forgets. It's the hard part. They think, okay, we bought the GPUs, we downloaded the open source model, we are sovereign now.
Right. Mission accomplished. Check the box.
Hardly. Because owning a model is secondary to the capacity to govern it.
Expand on that. What does that capacity actually look like?
Well, decentralization requires deep technical maturity. You need engineers who can actually run these things. ML ops, data engineers, hardware specialists. It's not trivial.
Okay.
It also requires legal foresight lawyers who understand AI liability and copyright in this new world. And most of all, it requires systems thinking capacity.
You need to understand how the whole system fits together, not just your little piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that human capital, you risk a very specific and very dangerous failure mode. Decentralization without cognition.
Or freedom without tools.
That's the phrase from the source. You have the right to decide. You are sovereign on paper, but you lack the means to execute. You have a supercomputer in the basement, but no one knows how to program it. Or worse, you program it badly and it hallucinates legal advice that causes total chaos.
And the source notes that most regions are currently still building these muscles, and some aren't even trying at all.
That is the danger. If you rush to decentralize without building the capacity first, you might end up with a system that is actually worse than the centralized one. It might be slower, dumber, and more expensive.
And it creates a cognitive divide, not just between rich and poor nations, but between those who can manage their own intelligence and those who are forced to buy it from someone else.
And that divide might be the most important geopolitical fault line of the next 20 years.
So let's pivot to the positive then. Let's not end on that note. What does it look like when it's done right? What is the vision here?
When it's done right, decentralized AI acts as a multiplier of agency. It enhances the capability of the local population without stripping them of their control.
Give me some examples. Paint the picture for us.
Okay, imagine education. Currently, a student in a remote village might use a translation tool that gives them a rough approximation of English content. In a decentralized, localized future, they have a tutor AI that runs on a local server. It speaks their local dialect fluently. It understands their local cultural references. It teaches math, using examples from their own environment, farming, fishing, not examples from New York or London.
That resonates. It makes the technology accessible, not alienating.
Right. Or imagine legal systems. An AI that doesn't just read the law, but understands the intent behind it in that specific jurisdiction. It could speed up justice, reduce backlogs, but keep the interpretation of the law within the sovereign borders.
And economies. This feels like a big one for emerging markets.
Oh, massive. If you are renting intelligence from a foreign provider, you are constantly sending money out of your country to them. It's called token spend. It's a trade deficit.
A cognitive trade deficit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you run local models, that value stays in the local economy.
Yeah.
You are paying local engineers, local data centers, local power companies. You retain that value.
And civic tools.
Tools that answer to the community. If the community decides the AI is biased against a certain group, they can change it. They don't have to petition a boardroom in San Francisco and hope for a reply. It restores democratic accountability to the digital sphere.
So the conclusion of this argument isn't about destroying the giants. It's about rebalancing the terrain.
That's it. Let the frontier labs build the massive engines. Let them spend the trillions on the next GPT-6. But let the rest of the world adapt those engines locally, ethically, and contextually.
It's a hybrid model. Global engines, local steering.
That is the path to a resilient future. It prevents the monoculture from taking over everything.
This has been a fascinating look at the structural side of AI. It's so easy to get lost in the hype of what the tools do and completely forget to ask who owns them.
And that ownership question, I think, is going to define the next decade.
I think we have time to go back to one thing you touched on earlier, because while we've been talking about nations and companies, this affects the individual listener too.
It absolutely does. The concept of decentralization scales all the way down to the individual.
So if I have a personal AI, an agent that manages my calendar, my emails, my health data, who does that agent work for?
That is the critical question. If you are using a free agent provided by a big tech company, who is the real customer?
The advertiser, or the company's data mining division.
Correct. The agent might be helpful, sure, but its ultimate loyalty is to the shareholder of the company that built it. It might nudge you towards certain purchases. It might withhold information that isn't considered brand safe. It is not on your team.
But if I run a local model, even a smaller one on my laptop or my phone,
then the agent works for you. It is a fiduciary. It has no conflict of interest. It doesn't report your data to anyone else. It is a loyal agent.
But the trade-off, again, is capacity. It's always capacity.
The local agent might be a bit dumber and might not know the very latest news from 5 minutes ago, but it is yours.
Yeah.
And for many people, that trade-off privacy and loyalty over maximum IQ is going to be worth it.
It's like the difference between a public library and a private journal. The library has more information, but the journal is yours.
That is a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And we need both, right? We need the centralized libraries of the frontier models for big, complex questions. But we absolutely need the private journals of local models for our personal lives and our sensitive data.
So the future isn't one or the other. It's a mesh.
It's a mesh of centralized giants and decentralized nodes.
Mm-hmm.
And the health of the entire system depends on the strength of those nodes. If the nodes are weak, the giants consume everything. If the nodes are strong, we have a healthy, diverse ecosystem.
I think that is a perfect place to land this. We've gone from the scary prospect of silent shutdowns to the hopeful vision of loyal agents and community standards.
It shows that the future isn't written yet. The centralization we see today is not inevitable. It's just the starting position.
It's the default setting, but we can change the settings.
We can absolutely change the settings.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into episode 28, I want to leave you with the final reflection from the source material. It's a question that really sticks with you, and I want everyone to just sit with it for a minute. In a future where every institution is powered by a prompt, will we be the ones finishing the sentence, or will we merely be reading from someone else's script?
That is the question of the century.
We are not done yet. We are continuing this journey. Up next is episode 29, Islands of Ingenuity. We are going to see who is actually picking up the pen. We are going to examine the emergence of local resilient nodes, how small groups and regions are building shelters from the storm of global disruption.
That's going to be a good one. Moving from the problem to the solutions on the ground. Practical examples, less theory, more action.
I can't wait. Until then, stay tuned, stay curious.
Stay systemic.